So in two of the last episodes and videos that I really made on this channel, I talked a lot about the things that I really just did not like about civil engineering and things that I really why I don't necessarily recommend this as a profession, specifically in 2026 and into the coming years into the near future into 2027, 28, 29 and probably in 2030 as well. But to make things fair, I also balanced that out by making another video talking about the things that I really loved about being a civil engineer. But in today's video, what I really want to dedicate this to is that if you are someone that is now really considering trying to become a civil engineer, or just simply put an engineer in general, but especially a civil engineer because that's my personal background, I want to talk about things that I really wish I knew before becoming a civil engineer. This is actually especially true because there were so many things that I think when I came into becoming a civil engineer in the beginning that I feel that I was very misled. Some of these things I feel like I was completely lied to about because they told me one thing but ended up delivering me something completely different. And some of these things are not necessarily lies, but there's certainly things that I think that people either mentioned but were very misleading, or just never mentioned at all, that was completely neglected to even be brought up, but that now that I'm looking back in my profession, really wish that someone told me at the time period before I took charge and decided to pursue a career in civil engineering. But with that being said, we're going to get right to this video. But as always, if you guys want to share support, because this is a brand new channel at the very end of the day, consider liking, subscribing, hitting the bell if you guys want to, because it is always greatly appreciated since this is a brand new channel. And we're hopefully going to make more videos talking about things like engineering. But I also want to talk about a lot of things related to stuff like school, academics, surviving college, life after college, adulting life, and just generally basing this basically a little bit of like a story time channel, where I just share stories about my daily life and things that hopefully you can take away in your daily life as well. So with that said, let's get started. So the first thing that I really wish I knew before becoming a civil engineer is probably just simply put about what an engineer even does to begin with. I think this is the part that's very important, because many people, when they become a civil engineer, they come into this with the belief that they think that this profession is about being able to design these cool things, right? Being able to design buildings, skyscrapers, bridges, infrastructure, all sorts of super cool things, maybe even using their design knowledge to design cars, airplanes, machines, mechanics, and all that stuff. But the reality is that while it is technically true, because you really do actually are designing buildings, bridges, skyscrapers, cars, buildings, airplanes and stuff like that, the reality I think that is very misleading, that a lot of people overlook, is really about the methodology to how you actually are going to be in charge of designing these things. And this is the part that's very important, because while it is technically true that you are going to be in charge of designing a building, a bridge, let's take for example being a structural engineer, right? Let's say you're trying to design a building. While it is technically true that you are going to be part of a project where you get to design these cool buildings, one of the things that I think is very misleading is really about the methodology to how you're going to be designing these buildings. Many people go into this profession thinking this is going to be a free world design where you can just basically move parts around, you can like design things and build things almost like Legos, right? Like when you're playing with Legos and you're trying to build up and figure out the best design to do a certain something. But the reality is that when you actually work in this profession, it is not a very creative profession at all. It is a very black and white profession. It is very to the point. There are a lot of rules. There are a lot of regulations. There are material properties you have to follow. There are building codes you have to follow. There's a physical manual, called the steel manual and called the concrete manual that you have to follow about things that you can design. So when you're putting up a building, for example, what you are really actually doing when it comes to building these buildings is that they might give you a beam or a bolt, right? Or a column of some kind, and you have to essentially decide how big does it have to be, right? What material to use, Where should it be placed? Stuff like that. And it's a very, very black and white procedure. It's very, very methodical, and it is not creative in any way, shape, or form at all, at least certainly with most jobs. There are a lot of restrictions. You have to please clients at the end of the day. And so as a result, it is a very, very restrictive profession if you are going into this thinking it's going to be a creative one where you can freely design. And I think that's the first thing that I really, really wish I knew, is just simply put, is this what we even do to begin with. I think that's a very, very big thing to really just understand. Now, the next thing that I think is really, really important to really bring up about what I wish I knew before becoming a civil engineer is going to be about the communication side, and really about the social scene and the communication, is because I think that it's, objectively speaking, we all know, most of us, that when you come into becoming an engineer, it's not a very diverse profession, right? We know it's dominantly male. There's not a lot of minorities. There's not a lot of people of color. And there's no push for representation, from my experience at least. There's no LGBT scene. Everyone is very, very similar to each other in that kind of way, shape, or form. But one of the things that I also think is so important is that a lot of people, that come into this profession tend to be a little bit more introverted, which we probably already know that, right? It tends to be a very, very relatively introverted crowd. But the part that I think a lot of people neglect is really about understanding how important communication skills are going to be in pursuing this career path. Many, many people go into this profession thinking that because they're relatively introverted, that they can get away with very, very average to even mediocre communication skills. When the reality is that a lot of civil engineering jobs, they involve working in teams. They involve being able to express your ideas, both verbally, like right now, but also on pen and paper. They involve being able to type up a very well detailed email of some kind when you have to communicate your thoughts and ideas, especially because a lot of these things can be relatively difficult to communicate because they are very complicated topics. They're very scientific, there's terminology that you have to understand. And so as a result, many, many people come into this profession thinking that because it can probably attract a lot of that it's probably a profession that attracts a lot of introverts, that they can kind of get away with very poor communication skills. But when the reality is that communication skills, aside from the fact that they're obviously very, very neglected, they're actually also very, very important if you're going to try to pursue this career path. I personally found this as sometimes a very, very relatively lonely profession to be in, even for me. Not because you're not working with people, because as we've already established, you are working with a lot of people, but because of the kinds of people you typically work with, it can even feel a little bit lonely at times because of the culture, the lack of communication, the lack of team chemistry, the lack of push for team chemistry. A lot of this stuff, I think these are just things that you have to know about if you are going to pursue a career in this field. Now, the next thing that I really, really want to talk about, if something that I really, really wish I knew, is really about the fact that the learning never stops. And I think that's another very, very big one, because a lot of people, when they go into this profession, they go in with the mentality that while it is true, obviously, that college is a very, very difficult time, that once they graduate college, everything is kind of home free. They're going to get that job and they're just going to basically rest and live everly, ever happily ever after, right? But the reality is that when you actually pursue this career path, the learning never, never stops. And in a lot of ways, it can even lead to a lot of burnout that people are not always prepared for. When you graduate college, not only was it already difficult to get through college, but at least as a civil engineer, when you get through college, you are going to be now in the workforce. You are going to be taking a lot of exams related to the different licenses you have to get. You have to, take an exam to become an engineer in training. You probably have to take the PE exam if you become a structural engineer. You have to get your professional license. And a lot of these exams, they're very difficult. And even on the actual job itself, there is so much complexity to it that you almost always feel like the goalpost is always being moved. You have a target and a goal you're trying to hit, and you either will never hit that target or you will hit that target, but once you hit that target, it just becomes moved further. and then once you hit that, it becomes moved further, and then when you hit that, it becomes moved further, and it's basically just a never-ending cycle that can lead to a lot of burnout. And I think that's something that I really, really wish I knew before becoming a civil engineer, or just simply put an engineer in general, but specifically in my case, a civil engineer. And then probably the last thing, but a very, very big thing that I really want to cover, to something that I really wish I knew before becoming an engineer, is really going to be about the lifestyle that an engineer is going to have to live, and really about the work-life balance. And this is very important because many people, when they become an engineer, they go in with the impression that this is going to be like a traditional 40 hours a work week kind of situation, which there are jobs that are actually absolutely, you do work 40 hours a week, but I like to think that a lot of the more interesting and popular jobs that people are going to go for, which is of course a little bit subjective, but just from my observation and opinion, things such as like structural engineering, construction, working as a contractor for like some kind of big firm that, puts together big projects, right? A lot of the more desirable jobs, there are deadlines, there are tight restrictions, as we've already established, and as a result, because of that reason, work-life balance can be a really, really difficult thing in this industry, especially if you are trying to going back to the architectural, structural, construction, engineering world. This is one of those things that I think I wish people told me about back when I started. It was one of those things that I think most people choose their profession either because they're trying to go after passion, because they maybe love math and science and design, or they're trying to go after money, right? Or hopefully a balance of both. Money and passion. But what people, I think, often neglect to really think about is going to be about the lifestyle that you're going to have to live in order to achieve and have that money and be able to practice your craft of engineering. Long story short, what I'm trying to get here is that work-life balance can be very, very difficult depending on the specific niche and branch of engineering that you are going into. But that one thing for certain is that to have to please clients, deadlines are going to be very real. Having to hit certain targets are going to be very, very important. And as a result, I think that I wish someone told me about the lifestyle that you're going to have to live, about becoming an engineer, having to live that, rough work-life balance and making all of the sacrifices that you have to make to become an engineer. The sacrifices that you have to make in school, when you're just pursuing the education side of being a civil engineer, right? Because of the long hours, the difficult exams, the classes, and everything like that, to the difficulties that you have to face when you're actually in the workforce. All of these things are challenges that I really, really wish that I knew before I became a civil engineer. But of course, there's so many things that I can share, so maybe if that's something, if you hopefully found this video relatively insightful before it gets too long, subscribe if you guys want to, like, comment, feel free to share any thoughts, questions. I watch and read all the comments, so it is always really nice to hear from you guys. But with that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. As always, stay safe, stay well, and hope to see you guys next time. Thank you guys so much again.